Have you ever wondered how cults make money? Well, I have. After doing some research on very famous cults and even speaking to some former and current cult members throughout the past year, I started to become interested in a completely different side of cults. It's their finances and their funding. And oh boy, you'd be surprised how some of these cults made and continue to make money today. Now, a lot of cults do it I'm going to say, quote unquote, normal way and are funded through their many, many members. This is pretty common to see in church-derived cults where the members are expected to give a certain percentage, and in some cases, all of their earned income to the cult, and by its extension, its leaders. A good example of this is the Remnant Fellowship Church, a Christian weight loss cult I discussed in a previous video. It sourced a lot of their funding through these means, but they also had several local businesses run under the tax-exempt nature of their church that were used to make its leader, Gwen Shamblin Lara, a very, very wealthy person. Less official cults that are so whacked out that the government doesn't even recognize them as a legitimate religious group will go as far as to encourage their members to obtain high-paying jobs in specific fields in order to fund the cult. A great example of this was the Heaven's Gate cult, whose leaders T and Do encouraged their followers to obtain certain careers in the rising computer industry, so they were all very well paid. Another common way is cults will make money through farming on communes that they live on, but these tend to be much smaller scale operations. Now, on the flip side of all of these, there are cults whose leaders clearly went to business school and make money through actual companies that their leaders/notable members will run. And I'd like to highlight a handful of those today. Maybe you heard of them, or maybe you use some of their services. And if you have, then, well, you're funding a cult and you didn't even realize it. Falun Gong, or Falun Dufa, began in China in 1992, founded by a man named Li Hongzhi during the country's Qigong boom. This is a time when meditation and energy practices got really popular. While Falun Gong, in particular, became a very large and popular movement amongst all the others. To briefly summarize their beliefs, they have three core pillars: truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. These are considered the highest virtues in the universe, and practitioners believe that by living these principles and performing Falun Gong's 5 meditative exercises, which kind of just look like Tai Chi, they can purify their minds and bodies and burn away bad karma, and ultimately reach enlightenment. It sounds pretty innocent, so why am I implying that they're a cult? Well, their beliefs aren't all just happy karma and rainbows and Tai Chi. Seeing that their leader, Li, founded and essentially made up his own spiritual movement, and seeing that he's still alive, there's bound to be some cult aspects when it comes to how his followers view him. From what I see online, many of Falun Gong's practitioners see Li as a sort of near-divine being who is spiritually enlightened. But it's not that he's just good at meditating. A lot of his followers believe he's essentially some sort of superhero demigod who has the ability to levitate, walk through walls, and my favorite is see into the future. If your followers believe that, that's never a good sign. Well, Li's teachings are also not just about spiritualism. He's been described as ultra-conservative, generally disliking most things about the modern Western world, and I really do mean most things. He's spoken negatively about homosexuality, feminism, art, culture, and has even denounced modern medicine, encouraging his followers not to use it if need be. And to top off the cult-like behavior, Li has instructed his followers to largely downplay their controversial beliefs when speaking to people in the general population. Oh yeah, and they do Qigong in these giant public groups while wearing these bright yellow shirts that say Falun Dufa is good. It's really good cult imagery. What's the deal with them besides them being a giant Chinese Qigong cult-like entity? Well, it's partially that the Chinese government also hates them. While the Qigong movement was popular amongst the people of China, it was not popular to the CCP of the 80s. In fact, religion as a whole, from what I can tell, is not very welcomed across China unless the state can have some sort of influence and control within its power structures and leaders so that the religion can't grow enough power to subvert any power or loyalty away from the party. Fun lighthearted stuff. Well, Falun Gong, in the mid-80s, their members fled to the neighboring countries like Hong Kong and Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, but a large portion of them, including their leader, fled to the United States and New York City, where they've set up their international headquarters. Since this little falling out between the Chinese state and the Falun Gong, they've sort of been in this like mudslinging subversive propaganda war with each other for nearly 40 years. I've called them cult-like instead of a full-on cult because a lot of the quote Falun Gong as a cult narrative is fueled by the CCP, who have been the number one proposer of this claim for a very, very long time in order to create a generally negative sentiment of Falun Gong domestically but also abroad. And on the flip side, Falun Gong also has some cult-like beliefs and displays a lot of cult-like behaviors, so, maybe they're not entirely wrong about them being a cult. So, yeah, Falun Gong didn't take all of this mudslinging laying down, though. They ended up starting their own subversive defamation campaign against the CCP, but who would listen to a weird Kugong pseudo-cult, right? Their thoughts exactly. Maybe Li can see into the future. So to more legitimize their claims, Falun Gong would start their own media companies, and they launched the Epoch Media Group. At first, it consisted of a small newspaper and a TV channel. Both were called the Epoch Times and the New Tang Dynasty Television. While these were local in New York originally and largely marketed to the local Chinese population, they've both grown into a much, much larger entity. NTD Television is now available in multiple countries across the world, but it's not as much as a name as the Epoch Times. You see, back in the late 2010s, around 2018, 2019-ish, the Epoch Times decided to do a bit of this rebrand. Playing off the rise of the American Republican Party and conservative values, the Epoch Times started to echo much of the American right-wing talking points. Falun Gong's leader was a big fan of Trump, too. He liked that Trump was a conservative figure that more or less aligned with his own conservatism. But more importantly, Trump had a very, very hard-on-China approach, something that Falun Gong could benefit from ultimately. So between 2019 and 2021, the Epoch Times turned themselves into this based right-wing, no BS, free speech, and extremely anti-China newspaper. They advertised on YouTube shows with popular right-wing influencers and increased its revenue by nearly 700%. Reportedly making over $100 million a year, though this figure has dropped significantly since it's back down to only about $10 million a year, and who knows what percentage of that are already Falun Gong practitioners. But for a while there, young conservatives were spending their hard-earned cash to buy a newspaper that's run by a Qigong Tai Chi pseudo-cult. Oh, but we are not done there. Falun Gong also owns another weird thing you may have heard of. That weird Chinese musical show thing, Shen Yun. Yes, that Shen Yun. See, Falun Gong is a lot more present than you thought, and you probably didn't even know they existed or were behind any of these things. Well, Shen Yun is another blow at the CCP, too. I'll quote their description of the performance from the website. Quote, "It aims to revive traditional Chinese culture as it has been lost under communist rule." Now, their legitimacy of how authentic to old Chinese culture has been questioned, with many calling this performance a reimagining of Chinese culture in the eyes of Falun Gong. For it being a show rooted in tradition, Shen Yun has a lot of political elements. Falun Gong style spiritualism and a subplot about Falun Gong practitioners in China being persecuted by the CCP. Sounds very traditional. Shen Yun tries to subvert this by marketing it as the aforementioned return to traditional Chinese culture. They've also done a really good job at astroturfing reviews. If you watch their ads, it's very clear that these paid actors are giving these real reviews after leaving the show, talking about how it was the greatest thing ever and they can't wait to see it again. Now, I'm not sure how many people are actively going to traditional Chinese dance and culture orchestral stage performances, but Shen Yun reported in 2024 that they own $250 million in assets? What? They claim that this is a result of 20 years of the show, but just 9 years prior, in 2015, they only reported $50 million in assets. Now, these numbers, they might be a little bit dirty. Something I didn't mention about the Epoch Times was that they are currently under investigation for fraud in money laundering, which brings their 700% revenue increase into question. And I'm not saying that Shen Yun's $250 million in assets could be the same thing, but seeing that both are owned and operated by Falun Gong, yeah, you be the judge there. So if you're someone who likes reading anti-CCP conservative newspaper and going to traditional Chinese cultural shows, you might be funding a cult. Okay, so let's say you spend the whole day reading said newspapers and watching said performances. You may find yourself being a bit hungry, in the mood for a delicious sandwich, and you may find yourself at a particular restaurant with a nice organic hippie granola feel to it. So unsuspecting. And, oh boy, do I have some news for you. Your sandwich is a product of child labor and you're funding a cult. Way back in 1972, in Chattanooga, Tennessee, there was a Christian teenage ministry called the Light Brigade who started living in a communal fashion. Off to a normal start. At first, they were just part of the normal Christian churches around the area, notably the First Presbyterian Church. Unfortunately, the teenage commune living Light Brigade were a bit of troublemakers for the church, not by acts of malice or what would be deemed as misbehavior by normal people, but rather it was who they were bringing to the church. The Light Brigade wanted to bring as many people into their faith as they could, no matter their class or race, and this was a practice that didn't float well with the First Presbyterian Church down in Chattanooga. One faithful Sunday, the Light Brigade arrived to church expecting to have their usual Sunday service, only to find that the church was closed, the doors were locked, and Mass was postponed. In light of the Super Bowl, as a group of young religious fanatics, you can imagine they didn't really take to this blasphemy too well. As a result, their leader, a man named Gene Spriggs, decided it was time to make a new church. Spriggs and his newly renamed 12 Tribes religious group would open up the Vine Christian Community Church, sprouting up multiple locations, each with their own sandwich shop called the Yellow Deli attached to them. Eventually, Spriggs' new religious group started to catch negative attention. They would hold masses in public, which they called critical mass. That's a great name. And they started baptizing people outside of the authority of any church. And they still lived on a commune while growing. It wouldn't really take too much time for the 12 tribes to be labeled as a cult both locally and nationally, but the group persisted in their ways, opening a second Yellow Deli in downtown Chattanooga and continuing operations just as normal. The people of the city were not happy with this new cult, not because of the sandwiches, they were pretty good, but because it was a growing cult in a relatively smaller town. Anti-cult activists started hosting deprogramming workshops in an attempt to sway their members into leaving, but this proved to be rather ineffective. But what constituted them as a cult? Was it just because they made some holy sandwiches and lived on a commune? No. While their leader Spriggs had some interesting beliefs and practices, and to many they were on the concerning side. They're sort of a Christian doomsday cult. They believe that every Christian denomination has completely fallen and refused to align their beliefs with any other sect, and they believe that in order for the Messiah to return, a true church must be restored, just as it was described in Acts 2:38-43 and Acts 4:32-37. And this isn't just the restoration of the first century church, but also the creation of a new Israel. They believe we are currently in the end times, but thankfully for them, it hasn't happened in the 50 years they've been around. And they don't really have an exact date for when the world's going to end either. This is typical stuff for a cult. All the other people are wrong except for me, and the world is ending, and you can help restore it with my directions. Classic shit right there. Well, don't worry. Their beliefs don't worry. Their stuff, it gets a little worse. The group believes there are 3 eternal destinies. It believes that after the fall of man, every person was given a conscience, and after dying, that every person goes to a state of being just called death, regardless of their faith. And upon the future second coming of Yeshua, their name for Jesus, believers will be brought back for the 1,000 years to reign with Yeshua before the last judgment. And at the end of all of this, all the non-believers will be judged according to their deeds, they will be put into one of two groups, which will be the righteous and the filthy/unjust. The filthy and the unjust will be sent to the lake of fire, where they will swim forever, while the righteous will go on in eternity and fill in the universe with Yeshua. Very, very lighthearted stuff. And can you guess who they think they're going to be? The righteous. Well, anyways, back to their timeline. By the 1980s, the 12 tribes were getting run out of Chattanooga and relocated to a remote town in Vermont called Island Pond. Why there, you ask? Well, a local church there offered Spriggs to be a pastor, which he declined, but the remote town in the remote state definitely was a good location for a growing cult. So they moved there. I also have to note that members of the 12 tribes used to follow the Grateful Dead around to recruit members. Truly, the world would be so different without the dead. Speaking of the world, the 12 tribes also found themselves going international, all following the same beliefs and having the same strange rituals. Ah, yes, about the rituals. When the 12 tribes made their move up to Vermont, they started to change a bit. For starters, they started wearing these distinct clothes, or at least the women did. It had to do with their ever so unique courtship rituals. So imagine this. If you're a 12 tribes member and you and your special friend of the opposite gender are interested in getting married, you have to go through a quote-unquote waiting period, in which they do get to spend some time together while receiving input from the community. And once this stage is passed, if you're a child, you'll need parental consent. Yes, if you're a child. But if you're an adult, you need to obtain approval from the entire community you live in if you want to get married to this person. And if you do get married, you get to do a pre-enactment of what the group thinks will happen when Yeshua returns during the end times to meet his bride. Does this sound like a cult to you yet? Well, anyways, the 12 tribes was pretty steadily expanding and they needed more money. They already all lived on communes, so the cost of living was low enough, but that also meant that most members didn't have jobs. Thankfully, that wasn't a problem for them. Over the next few decades, the 12 tribes would open a litany of different businesses. These included, but are not limited to, construction companies, mate importers, a tea from Argentina, farms, a printing press, soap companies, and most famously, the Yellow Deli, with 33 locations across the US and even more across the entire world. But okay, wait a second, back up. That's a lot of businesses and a lot of real estate. In fact, the Denver Post estimates that the 12 tribes own nearly $36 million of real estate in the US alone. Now, while there is no public information on exactly how much money all of the 12 tribes' businesses are making, it's apparent that the profit margin is substantial, and one of the reasons for that is free labor. The quote-unquote employees of Yellow Deli, if one is to call them that, are all well aware of this and pretty much okay with it, because they're all members of the cult. But how does the cult get around this? Legally, any business operating in the United States is obligated to pay their employees at least minimum wage, hence the minimum part there. But the 12 tribes in the Yellow Deli get around this by saying that everyone that works at the deli is technically a partial owner. So what stops one owner from running away with all the money? Since you're a part owner and every given location requires a majority rule for any sort of business decision, and since the deli's quote-unquote employees are generally all members of the cult, they vote in favor of the cult, so not one person and one outsider can do a mutiny and take over. Speaking of a mutiny, on a side note here, one of my favorite YouTubers named Reckless Ben made a video where he abused this loophole and technically overthrew a Yellow Deli in San Diego. I'm linking that video in the description because he goes undercover and he lives with the 12 tribes on their commune. It's a great YouTube video. He's the best cult YouTuber. Another way they have such large profits are the 12 tribes farms. Let's not forget that most members are living on a farming commune and are required to work said farms. And they do not reserve backbreaking manual labor for just adults either. Yes, Yellow Deli uses child labor, generally children born into the cult, for their farms and other businesses. But the farms are the easiest way to get around this since they are far removed from the general public in any sort of watchful eye. The 12 tribes have been caught on multiple occasions, in multiple locations, in multiple countries, using child labor, which generally will constitute child abuse cases. There are many, many more controversies surrounding the 12 tribes, but I've covered what pertains to their business operations for the most part, which is the main topic of today's lesson. And I already feel dirty after talking about them and sandwich shops, and I need to go wash my hands. This is really weird packaging. All these like religious quotes, but they're not from anything. 18 in 1, man, they really are committed to this all-in-one shit, huh, man? Wait a second. Oh, is that a picture of the guy? You gotta be kidding me. You gotta be kidding me. This isn't a fucking cult, is it? Okay, well, it's not a cult. We're gonna end on a light note here, but with a little bonus round. Dr. Bronner's. It's not essentially a cult, but more of just like a weird religion that the guy had. Have you ever looked at a Dr. Bronner's bottle and seen those massive walls of text? Are they Bible verses? No, it doesn't look like it, but they do sure talk about God and read like a Bible verse. Well, these are the main ideas of the late Dr. Emanuel Bronner's unique religious philosophy. Dr. Bronner was the third generation of Jewish German soap makers, and he originally came to the United States in 1929. He would help design factories and aid in the formulating of several soaps for a few years after arriving, and he would eventually get married along the way in 1934, having 3 children, one of which was unfortunately born very sickly and suffered an early death in 1944. Throughout this personal hardship, Dr. Bronner would embrace a new form of faith that he later referred to as the All-One God. To sum it up, he essentially believes all religions are equal and that we're all children of the same God and should therefore unite as one humanity. Or as he puts it, we're all one or none. But he really lived by this new all-one faith he had created and implemented into his craft, creating an all-in-one Magic Castile soap. In the post-World War II era, Dr. Bronner started to tour the U.S. giving lectures about his new faith, now calling it the All-One Peace Plan, selling his homemade magic soap on the side. But unfortunately and fortunately, people weren't really interested in the all-one faith Dr. Bronner was preaching, but were more interested in his really useful soap. Again, in the post-war era, natural soaps had kind of fallen out of the norm, so as a result, his all-in-one lectures were sought out not for all-one God, but for the all-in-one soap. And Dr. Bronner was smart enough to realize that this was occurring. So, as a result, he crammed as much of his teachings and philosophy of the all-in-one God faith onto the all-in-one magic soap. And the design hasn't changed since. That's why it looks like that. This was all good for business, but there was a slight problem that Dr. Bronner had been running the company under the All-One God Faith LLC, which he himself had deemed a tax-exempt religious organization, which the IRS disagreed with and forced him to file for bankruptcy. Thankfully, his son would swoop in and save the day, and would make the company a for-profit, but maintain the ethical business practices Dr. Bronner had established. And the brand became synonymous with conservation and has funded many charities over the years and has raised awareness for many different causes. See, not really a cult, but just kind of weird religious-themed soap. Well, there we have it today, folks. What did we learn? I guess if a company is kind of weird, do your research on them, and you may find out that it's either owned by BlackRock or, better yet, that you're funding a cult and you didn't even realize.